Okay, hi everybody. So this is the second of a two-part response to Richard Carrier. I hope you've seen the first part. The first part was a general response to a blog piece that he'd written about how the left and the right effectively nuked Atheism Plus. It went beyond Atheism Plus and it extends to this day. It's a blog piece that's well worth reading. I was mentioned several times in that piece, and effectively one video that I made became a case study within that blog piece. And whilst I accept some of the criticisms within that blog piece that Richard Carrier levels at me, I thought that he was unfair with reference to this video and motivated to tackle it. So that's what I wanted to do in this video, and I wanted to make it as a separate video because it would have intruded too much on what was already about a 48-minute video, even not including this. But it would have been out of step with the rest of that video. And this video was a video I'd made called Want Sports Gender Equality, Stop Whining and Do Something. Now I want to do three things in this video. One, I want to largely outline the case that I'd made in the original video, but to expand on it to some degree. The second is to give you the criticisms that Dr. Carrier had and respond to them. And third is to cite the evidence that I didn't cite in the first video. That's part of the business of remaking these videos, maybe to do those things that you could argue I should have done in the first video and didn't do. Okay, the outline of the video, just to give you a kind of TLDR version, was that if women want to achieve the same kind of revenue levels in women's sport as men do in men's sport, or get anywhere near, then it needs women to start investing in those sports as consumers and not bank on men investing in women's sports to the degree that they've invested in men's sports. Because this is the situation we are at, folks, at the moment. Whereas some sports it isn't really relevant to. Some sports there isn't a lot of money. There aren't many multi-millionaire badminton players out there. But we all know about the sports where you can earn vast sums of money. And these are the sports that we tend to talk about, and these are the sports that cause the controversy, because men are earning vast sums of money in these sports, and women, by and large, with possibly the exception of tennis, aren't earning anything like the same sums that women are earning. And this is the sort of the controversy. So the money is going into men's pockets, but we need to also be aware that by and large it's coming out of men's pockets, it's coming out of other men's pockets to go in those men's pockets. And maybe that is one of the first things that I should evidence, and I'll do that. But before I do that, let me just give you a little statement with regard to women's sport, because some of this could come off as somewhat mean-spirited, and that is the last thing that I am with regard to women's sport. My position with a lot of things with regard to women is that we should encourage girls to take as many different opportunities in life as they can, just the same as we should with boys. We should be doing exactly the same thing to expand their horizons. But generally I have well, if they don't want to pick up on those things, that's up to them. I feel a little bit different with regard to sport, because there are many knock-on benefits to getting involved in sport with regard to your health and lifestyle, and girls do fall behind. And it does seem, studies have shown, that girls are more resistant to picking up sport. It's not just that they're not encouraged, but they're more resistant even in things like PE lessons. Actually, the sort of interplay between girls discourages girls from taking part in sport. So maybe they need even an extra level of encouragement. And one of the ways in which we are encouraged in sport is looking at our sporting heroes. And girls tend to gravitate towards female heroes, and boys tend to gravitate towards male sporting heroes. They see them as role models, the same as we talk about role models in films and video games and seeing people who look like us and the benefit of that. And I buy into that. I've never said that I don't, and I think the same thing is true in sport. So there are benefits to promoting women's sport. But by and large, men's sport, in these sports where we have these large differentials, is funded out of men's pockets. Let me show you some statistics from the Premier League, which has by far the largest disparity in the UK. A huge disparity of about 1,000 times from the top male earner to the top female earner. Which statement most closely describes your interest in Premier League football? And here we show the percentage that agree that they at least have a light interest in Premier League football. And you can see that 39% of men in the UK and 13% of women have at least a light interest in Premier League football. But really what we're not really interested in who has a light interest in Premier League football. What we're interested in is who is the people that are sticking their hands in their pockets and paying for those tickets, going and watching the games. Who's the motive force behind going and watching those games when a couple goes and watches those games? Who are buying the shirts? Who's buying the merchandise and associated bullshit? Who is paying for the expensive Sky Sports subscription? Because this is where the revenue that is driving those huge wages is coming from. Okay, now I don't have the direct data for that, and I went looking for it and I can't find it, but I think I can make a fair case that it's coming out of men's pockets when you look at this next statistic, because it breaks down that previous chart into light interest, strong interest and passionate interest. And you can see from this that although a quarter of those who express an interest in Premier League football may be women, overwhelmingly they have a light interest. A third of those expressing a light interest were female, whereas only 10% of those expressing a passionate interest are female. Now, I can't prove this, right? I can't logically prove that this is true, but it seems incredible for it to be anything other than somebody with a passionate interest would be more likely to spend the large sums of a Sky Sports subscription to watch football than somebody who has a light interest. That somebody with a passionate interest is more likely to buy a shirt or a mug or a duvet cover than somebody who has a light interest. That somebody who has a passionate interest is more likely to buy that season ticket to watch the games at what can be almost £100 a throw than somebody who has a light interest. And indeed, if you look at the figures for Premier League attendance, what we do know is that men who are interested in the Premier League are more likely to go and watch the games than women, but still substantially 22% of those who are match goers are female. But the question then is, who is the motive force within that relationship, right? If those two couples if that couple was to split up, would both of them still go and watch that game? I would suggest in any couple where one of them has a passionate or strong interest and the other one has a light interest, that it's the one with the stronger interest that is providing the motive force that is responsible for both them going to do that. We all do these things with our partner. We all do things with our partner that we would not do if it was just us, but we do them because we are a couple. And the fact that overwhelmingly those with a passionate interest in Premier League football are male suggests to me that even when women are watching the Premier League on Sky Sports and are going and attending games, that a lot of the time the motive force behind that attendance is the guy that they are attending with. There is nothing sexist in me saying that. That's just a simple cold analysis. I might not have the actual direct data where they've asked people who is the motive force in your partnership, in your relationship between you going and doing that, but the simple stats on passionate interest versus light interest would lead me to believe that. So that's setting the scene there, that men's sport, we have in these certain sports, especially these team sports in Europe and in North America, men earning vast sums, women not earning very much. My suggestion is that is being funded out of men's pockets. And the whole basis of my video is to say, you know, girls, if you want women to earn as much to the same degree, then rather than keep looking over at the men and saying, why aren't you taking more interest in women's sport? Why aren't you showing the same passionate interest and sticking your hands in your pockets for women's sport the same as you are for men? Maybe the answer is for that huge untapped market of female sports fans to start sticking their hands in their pockets and supporting women's sport in the same way as men are supporting theirs. I don't particularly think that's a sexist argument. Now, what I want to do to address the points that Richard Carrier made is to read through some of the points that he made in his critique and to tackle them one by one. So let's make a start. A good example in Plum's case is his video, Want Sports Gender Equality? Stop Whining and Do Something. Eye-rollingly ridiculous and in result inadvertently sexist. Notably, he never cites any examples of anyone ever saying the thing he is criticising. So what happens? Immediately, he goes off the rails of reality. He instead attacks some sort of fictional feminist he invented in his head. Had he actually done research on this and committed to the first rule of good reasoning, never criticise fictional people, always give a real example of the real person whose arguments or claims you are challenging, he would have produced a much more useful and correct piece of criticism. Okay, I think that's a legitimate criticism. Not that it's eye-rollingly ridiculous, the argument that I'd made, but that I didn't actually cite any examples. If you want to know the backstory to that, which was on that day, maybe even mentioned it in the video, I'd seen 3 different pieces that had made the same kind of argument that had ignored entirely the bit about revenue and the revenue differentials, and that had exasperated me. I'd not made any links to them. I'd got a few minutes on my computer, and so I made a very quick video. Was that the ideal way of doing things? No. Should I have cited those examples? Yes. Am I going to rectify it in this video? Yes. So this is what Carrier goes on to say. Apart from village idiots, amateur activists and internet fools, and not, for example, in this case, the actual athletes in question or a professional journalist or analyst, no one has ever said all women in sports should always get paid the same as men, regardless of associated revenue. That's a pretty big claim to make, by the way. Generally, quite a good rule of thumb for arguing is never make such absolute arguments, because it's so easy to be falsified. Even if generally you're right in what you say, it's so easy to be falsified. If one team brings in the same revenue as another, those teams should be paid the same. But sometimes that isn't happening, and that's what angers people. Well, I beg to differ. It is true that there are cases where teams are bringing in the same revenue and people are angered about that, and I can understand that, but that is not what people are talking about. So, let me start with an example, and I wish that I could remember the 3 examples that I'd had on that day, but I couldn't, and the only example that I could remember was the Indian cricket example. So I've gone back and looked at that. But just let me set the scene briefly with regard to cricket, because in one way cricket is exceptional in sport, which is that pretty much in all men's sport, team sports, the big money is earned at the club level, not at the international level. And that applies on both sides of the Atlantic and throughout the Commonwealth, where sports like rugby, rugby league and cricket are played, is that it's at the club level where money is earned. But cricket is the exception. It's pretty much always been that way, apart from the recent introduction of the Indian Premier League, which is a very, very short form of the game. The international game has always been where it's at. It's always been where both the prestige is at, but also where the money, the revenue for the sporting authorities as well as for the individuals is earned, which is why we have these businesses of centralised contracts, because cricketers, especially male cricketers, were spending all their time playing for the national team rather than for their local first-class team. Okay, so this is important to understand that context. Gender pay gap in cricket angers Indians. 8th of March 2018 on the BBC. Indians have expressed outrage on Twitter after data from the cricket board showed that men players will earn 14 times more money than women. Top players of the men's team will earn 70 million rupees each per year, while women in the same category will make 5 million rupees. The board announced the new contracts for both teams on Wednesday. The pay gap has remained despite great performances from women's team, including reaching the World Cup final. So immediately there's some suggestion that it should be based on performance rather than the revenue generated. And yet we know, you only have to go back, I think, to 2015, where the World Cup, the Cricket World Cup for men and for women, was hosted in India. And we had this situation where the Men's World Cup was making a large profit and subsidising the Women's World Cup. In fact, that was why they decided to have both tournaments held side by side, was to allow this cross-pollination, was to allow some of the profits from the Men's World Cup to allow the Women's World Cup to take place. Despite that, there was still criticism there that the male players from around the world had been flown business class, whereas the female players had been flown standard class, and that they should have all been flown the same, despite the fact that they're playing in different tournaments, and one of them is only playing in a tournament at all by dint of the fact that the other tournament was subsidising it. But let me read you some of the comments here that the BBC has listed. Important point here is why such huge pay gap between men and women cricketers, right? No conception of the revenues involved. Isn't the BCCI, that's the Indian Cricket Board, responsibility to promote women's cricket as well? It should first start with equal pay so as to attract talent. In other ways, forget about the revenue. It should all be about equal pay. Here's another comment. Why there is so much pay gap between men and women? I feel BCCI is not giving importance to game of cricket. Rather, reward is based on the principle from where they are earning more revenue. It could not be more explicit there. That person has acknowledged that the men's game is generating more revenue and that the pay is based on revenue, and saying, how can that be a reasonable metric upon which to pay people? Right now, I cannot remember, unfortunately, the other two examples that I gave at the time. But one thing that is really interesting is that, bizarrely, Richard Carrier gave me some examples. Let me read you a little bit more Richard Carrier. For example, in America, women's soccer is more successful than men's, and by literally every measure now. Yet women players are paid a mere fraction as much, or were. A lawsuit just ended in negotiated settlement of equitable pay. See this article in Forbes, and this article in Bloomberg Business, and certainly this article in the New York Times. Then in brackets, those right there, the kind of things Plum could have read had he followed the rule of never arguing in the absence of evidence, always check first. Okay, so I read these articles and it was quite interesting to read. I'm going to show you the first two, the Forbes and the Bloomberg articles, and what they had to say there. Because it is true, if you look at this business with regards to the US women's and men's team, although they don't portray it particularly fairly in these pieces other than the New York Times piece, it is clear that there's probably a very good case to be made, and maybe a good case to be made that over the last year or two that the female players in America could have been played at the national level more than the male players have paid, because they have actually generated more revenue quite exceptionally. So I don't have a problem with that. But I read these pieces that Richard Carrier left, and I kind of wondered if he'd read it, because he's making this argument that nobody's suggesting that it shouldn't be linked entirely to revenue. So here is the piece from Forbes, and there is one passage, there is one paragraph about the women's team and the men's team, and even in that one paragraph it starts going, the alarming scale of the problem, so it's a problem, can be seen in a new report from Sporting Intelligence, which was a very good report actually if you go and read that, which found that male Brazilian forward Neymar earns more than the top 7 women's soccer leagues combined. Now, Neymar's salary and the salary of the top players is linked to the revenue of those leagues, and yet Forbes regards that as a problem, and then spends the rest of this article, the next paragraph and then a graphic, soccer's embarrassing gender wage gap, showing the wage gap not in terms of a national US league, a national US team where the women have generated more revenue than the men, but club competitions where the men's leagues are generating absolutely astronomical amounts of revenue, and the women's leagues often aren't generating any revenue whatsoever. The Bloomberg article was even more, as I could see, evidence for my case that people are ignoring the revenue as it was for anything else. The women have always been doing the same job as the men for the same labour and doing it better, not at least as good, said Jeffrey Kessler, the labour lawyer who is representing the women. As women's sports have grown more popular, so has the pressure on sports teams to re-examine the pay policy for male and female players. Norway this week said it will pay its men and women's national soccer players equally for the first time, and indeed that has happened in Norway, despite the fact that the male players are generating far more revenue than the female players, they're going to pay them both the same. So there's an example where the whole principle of revenue has been thrown out the window. But what was most interesting was the final comment that Jeffrey Kessler, the Labour lawyer who's representing the women, said. Listen to this. He explicitly spells it out. Kessler said that, win or lose, revenue for men's sports should not part of the equation. Missing form out there, I think. Should not form part of the equation. The reason they are entitled to equal pay is that they are engaged in equal work. He could not be any more explicitly clear in that pay should not be tied to revenue. It should be tied to the principle of equal pay for equal work, and revenue be damned. I was somewhat gobsmacked to find that in a link that Richard Carrier had sent me to say, why didn't Noel Plum look at these links? And then he would have seen that the argument that he was making was fallacious. And then when I go and look at the link, I find the lawyer for the women in the US soccer case making the exact case that I was saying that people were making. Here's another example from a website called Grazia Daily, which is a feminist website. There's still a gender prize money gap in sport, but a new study said it's closing. We all know that women have long been unfairly paid a huge amount less than men in sport, but it looks like that's on its way to changing. So immediately we're at this point, immediately on this line that it is unfair, that paying according to revenue is unfair. It then quotes a global study by BBC Sport and then says the following thing. The study looked into the prize money awarded at World Championships and events of similar standing. It didn't look into things like wages and sponsorship, an area that women in sport continue to experience a huge disparity in earnings to their male counterparts. But there are 44 sports that specifically award prize money, and 35 of them apparently pay equally. A brilliant thing for women who participate in these 35 sports, but to look at this realistically, it's still continued unfair treatment of the women entering the other 9 sporting competitions. Okay, so they're quite clear about this. The author is quite clear. It is unfair for women entering these other 9 sporting competitions that there is this disparity. The first one it then links is the Premier League versus the Women's Super League, which is the main association football league in the UK, versus the equivalent for women in the UK. So I had a look at that BBC link. Okay, and if you go to the back of that BBC link, it gives you the statistic that is of importance here, and this is what it says. With regard to the Premier League and the Women's Super League, football remains one of the sports where, although the pay gap has closed, there are still big differences in the prizes for men and women. There is currently no prize money in the Women's Super League, while the Premier League winners Chelsea receive 38 million this year. Okay, let's look at the actual statistics here. This is the statistics for payments to clubs that the Premier League makes. Now, let me parse these statistics for you. The Premier League makes a shitload, a boatload of television revenue and central commercial revenue as a result of its activities. And this is how it divvies up its money. The overseas TV money it divvies up equally to all 20 Premier League clubs. The central commercial revenue it divvies up equally to each clubs. From the domestic TV money that it gets from its huge lucrative contacts with Sky Sports and with BT Sport, it gives an equal share of about £35 million to each club. It also pays a facility fee, which is effectively proportional to the amount of games featuring that club that have been shown live on domestic television. But then it also makes a merit payment. And that is what is being called the prize money here. Effectively, the prize money is the merit payment. So Chelsea, for winning the league, gets a 38 million merit payment. Sunderland, finishing last, only gets about a 2 million merit payment. Now, see how absurd it is to suggest that this is an unfair prize money that the Women's Super League isn't experiencing. After all, the Premier League could say, do you know what, we're not going to pay a merit payment, we're going to pay each team the same. They're each going to have a larger equal share of about another £20 million each, and we won't have a merit payment, and then they could claim that there's no prize money whatsoever for the Men's Premier League, just the same as the Football Association, which is a separate entity, pays the Women's Super League. So this is an entirely arbitrary sum, this prize money. That is just their method of dividing up the domestic television revenue they get, and yet it is being portrayed in this feminist article as an unfair manifestation of prize money for men, that effectively they're getting paid 38 million for women and the women aren't getting paid anything. Separate employers. The Premier League is not the Football Association. They are an independent body which since 1992 has negotiated separately and has done such a wonderful job. It's sent the revenues of men's football through the roof. The Women's League does not have that. They have not set that up for themselves in the way that the men's club have for themselves. They're still under the auspices of the Football Association, and they don't earn any prize money because there isn't any money to pay them in prizes. Right, so I would hope on behalf of that I have evidenced that people are making arguments that go contrary to the idea that paying proportional to revenue is an acceptable way of doing it. And then Carrier goes on to say this, and this is a little bit of an aside, but it's still a point worth making. Even the WNBA, which obviously earns vastly less than the NBA, and then puts in brackets something I entirely agree with, so we certainly shouldn't expect equal pay by gender there, any more than we'd expect bottom-ranking men's teams to earn as much as top, is still not at parity in pay, even in proportion to revenue. NBA payroll is 50% of its revenue, WNBA payroll is 33%. That raises some eyebrows. I should just point out here, and this doesn't apply to national teams where you don't have the same kind of market forces involved, but the amount that you pay a team is obviously not just going to be proportional to revenue, it is also going to be proportional to the level of competition over attracting people's signatures. 50% the NBA pays of its payroll. 18 out of 20 teams in the Premier League would give their eye teeth to have a payroll figure of only 50% of their revenue. Why? Because there is such a strong competition for the best players in football, because the Premier League are also competing against La Liga, against Serie A, against the Bundesliga, against Ligue 1 from France, right? They're also competing against these other rich leagues for these signatures, and so that inflates the price, and so consequently if you want to be one of the top teams you have to pay a greater proportion of your revenue. So it's not simply a case necessarily of sexism, right? When you're raising your eyebrow, it's not necessarily a case of sexism that the NBA is paying 50%. It's just that maybe there is more competition over those top signatures within the teams than there is within the WNBA, which could be a function of how many particularly rich teams there are versus poor teams. If the overall standard of wealth is greater and similar between the teams, then that's going to cause more competition. Whereas if the top 3 or 4 teams are vastly more wealthy than everybody else, they're really only competing amongst themselves for the very best players. So that might be something for you to consider. The next bit, this is the second argument. Really, we got involved in 2 debates here. One was over the fact that I'd not evidenced the fact that people were making this argument to begin with, and that Richard Carrier claimed that I'd effectively strawman made this argument, trumped it up. Nobody's making this claim that it shouldn't be based on revenue. I hope I've shown some examples of people who clearly are. But then there was this other case about bias, about whether it's reasonable that men watch men's sport more than they watch women's, etc. This is what Richard Carrier had to say. Audience bias is also a thing. There isn't any objectively coherent reason we should be so much more interested in men's competition than women's. Okay, I disagree with that. I mean, I don't know we could argue what is an objectively coherent reason and what isn't, and get into philosophical arguments about what amounts to objective coherence in this particular sphere. But there seems to me some very, very good reasons why men would be more interested in men's sport than women in women's sport, and why everybody would have generally a greater interest in men's sport than women's sport. So let me try and separate both those cases. I think I mentioned already the whole business about having role models. I'm very, very interested in cycling, and I watch some women's cycling as well as men's cycling. But recently, the Giro d'Italia stage was at stage 19. Chris Froome launches a wonderful 80-kilometre long-range attack on, is it the Finestra, right? And it's wonderful to watch. And I'm watching that, and I go to bed that night. It's been one of the biggest days in Grand Tour racing for years. And I go to bed, and I'm imagining myself as Chris Froome. I'm imagining what that would be like to go from 3 minutes down on the general classification to in the lead, when there's marvellous circumstances on that, going out on your own. And I can associate with that. And I don't think that I can associate that the same if it was a woman's race I was watching. I wouldn't be able to put myself, because all the other racers would be women. So it takes a much more leap of imagination. And part of the enjoyment of sport is imagining yourself as the champion, imagining yourself as Lionel Messi or Ronaldo or Magical Jordan or whoever the fuck it is in basketball, right? That is part of what it is about. That's why we need these female role models in sport, because that is what enfranchises women and gets them to start taking part to the same degree. Indeed, with regard to Chris Froome, I feel a particular sort of, I can get even more into Chris Froome in that sense, because I'm not as skinny as Chris Froome, but we're similar height, we're similar kind of build. And although he's vastly more skilled than I am on the bike, his balance of skills as somebody who can time trial as well as a climber, he's not one of these little diddy 5-foot climbing twats, right? That isn't me. So I can't put myself in the role of one of those to the same degree as I could a Chris Froome, whose skills lie somewhat different in terms of his balance of cycling skills. So this is the thing, and this is why juniors are often more invested in younger riders, that older people often champion the older hero within sport. It goes across the board, does it not? Is that objectively coherent? I don't know. Can you make a case that it isn't? It just seems quite natural that we would gravitate towards things such as that because we see heroes who reflect ourselves, which is an argument that I've heard feminists make time and again in lots of other spheres in the media, which kind of leaves my head scratching that you're railing so strongly against it here. And then there's also this fact that generally I think people are more interested in men's sport. And I think there is always going to be a disparity. And the reason is, your perspective, Richard, seems to be that it's about fun, that watching sport is all about fun, and that, oh, you can watch two teams play in the local park and it can be just as exciting, but that's bollocks, quite honestly. Yes, it can be just as tight and you can get some excitement from watching that, but one of the reasons people gravitate towards the top level of sport is because it's the top level of sport. And quite frankly, there is always going to be a disparity. When I watch the women's 100 meters race at the Olympics, what I'm watching is the winner is the fastest woman in the world. When I watch the men's race, it is the fastest human being in the world. And that is the differentiation. It doesn't matter what sport I'm watching. When I'm watching the tennis, I'm watching the best female players in the world versus the best players, the best human beings in the world at playing tennis, and that's always going to have an additional draw. And however much we respect women's sport, it's like respecting junior sport. It's like respecting masters sport, right? An age categorized sport. There's always an allure of the open, because that is where the best of the best in the world are. I mentioned it in a comment on Twitter. I repeat it here for the benefit of everybody else. I helped organise a couple of indoor rowing competitions where you string together Concept 2 rowing ergs, and you have the software on the wall, and it has these little digital boats, and everybody sets off and they row their 2,000 meters, and you can see how everybody's doing, and people go and watch and cheer. Okay. And the interesting thing is that it's really heavily divided. There's men's events, there's women's events. Okay, there's lightweight men, lightweight women, heavyweight men, heavyweight women. There is a juniors category. There is which goes up to 20-year-olds. Then there's an open category. Then there's a 40s to 50s, 50s to 60s, 60s to 70s, 70s to 80s. Right, for men and women. Right, there are all these different categories. And people who are in their individual category take a really particular interest in what is going on. Outside of their category, people are milling about. A few people are watching each race, taking some interest. The Men's Open is the race that everybody in the hall watches, right? Everybody, men, women, old, young, everybody watches that. Why? Because these are the biggest, fastest rowers in the room, right? And there's always an allure of that. It amazes me that you don't think that it's objectively coherent, that would be true, that somehow you see some kind of higher aesthetic ideal where we won't give a shit about that. Whereas we do in everything. What's the biggest tree that's ever lived? What's the biggest animal? What's the deepest ocean? What's the brightest star in the sky? We're always interested in those superlatives. And that's why everybody watches the Men's Open with their jaws halfway to the floor. Because for most of us, when I watch the women's lightweight 60 to 70-year-olds, frankly, I can pull what they're pulling with one fucking arm. When I watch the men's heavyweight open, right, I can maintain for about 20 seconds what these 17-stone aerobic brute fucking engines can sustain for about 5 minutes and 50 seconds. That is the excitement. That is the enticement. You're never going to get away from that. And it's always going to put a little bit of a gap there, I'm afraid, between men's sport and women's sport generally, I would propose. And I don't see that that is not objectively coherent. The last bit, two bits still that I wanted to comment on. One thing that Richard then says is that, but on top of all that, look at what the Women's Sporting Foundation is asking for. Attend women's sporting events, support companies that advocate for women's athletics, encourage television stations and newspapers to cover women's sport, sign up to coach a girls' sports team, encourage young women to participate in sports, become an advocate. Now, if you know a female athlete that has been discriminated against, advocate for her rights. There's nothing there that I disagree with. On my video that you said that was beyond ridiculous, there's nothing that disagreed with that. And I'm saying attend women's sporting events and support these things. Get it on the television. Pay for the subscription. Pay for the shirt. Right? Buy the tickets to go and watch the games. What I'm saying is, by and large, women need to get more invested in doing that. This is what Richard Carrier goes on to say. So they aren't filling fewer seats because they suck. They're filling fewer seats because we suck. We aren't paying them the kudos and fandom they are due. But unfortunately, what we're expecting is men, because it's mainly men watching sport, to pay the kudos and fandom and go and watch the games. What I'm seeing is that's an unrealistic expectation. Women need to start doing it. It's women, it's female athletes, it's women's teams. Women should be doing a lot more of the groundwork. If any group can be highlighted as saying that is the group that is sucking here, it's the women who are doing the sucking, not the men. Fna, fna, fna. Okay, in this particular case. That is the point that I'm making. And what is so frustrating, regardless of how ridiculous you might regard my argument, is the potential. Particularly in your North America. Think about this. And I mentioned this briefly on Twitter again, but let me outline this. You have, you have a situation between the highest men's league, the MLS, and the highest women's league called the, I've got it here, the National Women's Soccer League, as it is now. Right. And think about the difference in potential here. The MLS is in a really, really difficult position. Why? Because there are the big four, aren't there? There's the American football, the basketball, the baseball and the ice hockey that dominate men's sport and men's sporting interest in what is quite a saturated market of men's sporting, the commercial side of it, the money that men are spending. They're watching adverts, they're buying TV subscriptions, they're buying shirts, they're going and watching games. They have been milked. The little udders of the male sports viewer has been milked incessantly, and men are already deeply invested in one or more of those sports. That is a very, very difficult market for MLS to crack as a men's sporting league. It's a really, really difficult thing. On top of that, there are these huge association football leagues in Europe that keep all the best players, that can pay all the big wages, and that can attract all the big players. Even if you got a higher level of money for the MLS, even if multi-billionaires came across and each took control of one of their teams, it would still be a tough nut to crack to get those best players, because those big European teams get to play in the Champions League, and all the top players want to play in the Champions League. However well you do in MLS, you're not going to get to play in the Champions League. It's run by UEFA. It's a league for European leagues. So that puts the MLS in a really, really difficult position. Contrast that with the position of the National Women's Soccer League, right? The National Women's Soccer League would be the only really, really successful women's team sports league in the United States, the only really, really successful women's sports league in the entire world. It can draw the best female soccer players from around the globe because there's no competition. There are no European equivalents paying astronomical salaries. There's no women's champion league that provides there is a women's champion league, but it doesn't provide anything like the same kind of draw as it would if you were playing in a highly lucrative, high-profile women's soccer league in the United States. There is the potential there for the women's soccer league in the United States to become the equivalent of the NBA or the NFL or the NHL, is it, the hockey, or whatever the baseball, World Series Baseball, WSB is. For the men, it could become the equivalent. And it doesn't even need the same investment from women as those leagues need from men, because there's only one of them and not four of them. Just a quarter of the investment from women in women's team sports, as men show in men's team sports, would provide a women's league for association football players in America and for around the world that would be the equivalent of any of those big four leagues, and would pay these astronomical salaries on the basis of those astronomical revenues. Does that sound ridiculous to you? It doesn't to me. The only thing that sounds ridiculous is when you have a look at the figures of the attendances, and if you take the Portland Thorns out of the equation with their 16,000s, the attendances, quite frankly, are sad. Boston and Chicago are barely and Kansas franchises are barely getting an attendance of 3,000 a game. If you compare the attendance to the football leagues, MLS, the Men's Soccer League, despite the competition from the Big Four, gets a total attendance of over 8 million a year. The Women's Soccer League gets 600,000, not even a tenth. It's hard not to say that the issue here is that women are not patronising women's sport in the same way that men are patronising men's sport. I don't think that's a sexist thing to make, and I don't think it's a sexist argument to make for me to say that if women want to put women's sports on the financially and in terms of the ability to earn these huge revenues on the same footing as men's sport, what it needs is not to keep hoping and praying that men are suddenly going to stop being interested in the leagues that they're interested in and start spending their money out of their pockets on women's sport. It's for women to start shelling out, women to start showing an interest, and women to start showing an investment in women's leagues. Okay, I hope, I'd be interested to know what everybody thinks. I'd be particularly interested to know in what Richard Carrier thinks to that. Does he accept that there are people that are making this case with regard to it being based on other things, such as merit or just base fairness rather than revenue, and they're quite prepared to wave away the revenue argument, so that's not relevant? Is he also prepared to admit that he's not really fair with this objectively coherent statement with regard to people prioritising men's sport to some degree over women's sport, and particularly men prioritising men's sport over women's sport? Okay, that's it. That's all I wanted to say. Hope you found this of interest. Thanks for watching. Bye.